At 16, Penelope Tree walked into Truman Capote's black and white ball, wearing a gown so provocative it was like a nuclear weapon going off through Manhattan's high society. Cameras froze on her, the long-limbed girl with the enormous eyes, looking like a visitor from another planet. In a single night, she went from an awkward debutante to the most talked-about face in fashion, and it was the accidental spark of a cultural revolution that would both make and destroy her. Years later, long after the lights faded, a shocking revelation exposed the quiet truth behind that glittering facade, and why Penelope Tree's life had always been a search for meaning beneath the image. Welcome to Society Mysteries. Penelope Tree's life began at an unusual intersection of both privilege and neglect. She was born in New York City in 1949 to one of the world's most glamorous mothers and one of its most absent fathers. Marietta Peabody Tree was a socialite and diplomat who lived for parties, people, and politics. Her father, Ronald Tree, had been a British Conservative MP and Winston Churchill confidant before remaking himself as a wealthy investor in Barbados. But neither seemed to have much time for the fragile, watchful child who grew up in their orbit. Penelope spent most of her early years with nannies, shuttled between New York and London, and she learned early that love in her family came with conditions and absences. By 7, she was riding the New York subways alone, a tiny figure with those big wide eyes exploring Greenwich Village like a runaway kid ghost. At boarding school, she was clever, musical and self-contained, but the constant comparisons to her elegant mother left her feeling ugly and invisible. Soon she was counting bites, skipping meals, quietly entering the long war of anorexia that would shadow her through youth. Yet she had something her parents didn't, real curiosity and a hunger for experience that would pull her out of that suffocating drawing room society. Her mother's friends included a certain Truman Capote, who one day found the young Penelope at a luncheon, introducing herself, bold as you like to tell him she admired his writing. Capote was amused. In fact, he was even rather touched that the youngster wanted so much to emulate him. He told her to write every day, because as he put it, talent means nothing if you don't. Around that same age, the photographer Diane Arbus spotted Penelope and persuaded her to sit for a portrait. The resulting images were an unnerving study of a lonely, rich child. As ever, the brilliant Arbus managed to photograph her subject's soul rather than merely her face. However, the images were too raw for her father, and he forbade their publication. The photos were buried, but their ghost would follow her. Arbus had seen something nobody else did, a strange, expressive beauty waiting to be released from good manners and parental frigidity. That release came one legendary night in 1966. Truman Capote's black and white ball at the Plaza Hotel was billed as the party of the century, and it was indeed a glittering menagerie of film stars, royals, politicians, and debutantes. Penelope was 16, the only teenager invited, wearing a black V-neck tunic slashed into panels that exposed a slim band of bare stomach. In a ballroom filled with diamonds and tuxedos, she looked almost extraterrestrial, simultaneously fragile, luminous, and defiantly young. Despite the procession of high society figures circulating, the cameras kept turning back to her. People whispered her name and looked on in awe and envy. Meanwhile, Cecil Beaton and Richard Avedon, two of the most famous photographers in the world, were both in the room, watching from different corners. By dawn, they were plotting to make her famous. The next morning, the phone rang at the Tree townhouse. It was Vogue's editor, Diana Vreeland. Avedon wanted to shoot Penelope immediately. Within days, Penelope was standing in his studio, nervous but instinctively knowing how to move after years watching her mother's graceful movements. Avedon told Vreeland something quite simple. She's perfect. Don't touch her. The resulting photographs were something stunning in 1966. A waif with wide eyes ringed in dark kohl, a halo of dark hair, it was the announcement of a new kind of beauty to the world. It was not polished or poised, it was vulnerable, alive, a little strange. London called soon after, and so did fate. In 1967, British Vogue flew her across the Atlantic for a shoot with the most famous photographer in England, David Bailey. She was 17, he was 29, and already married to glamorous French actress Catherine Deneuve. However, the first meeting between Bailey and Tree crackled with energy. Bailey, the working-class boy who had clawed his way into the aristocracy of fashion, was hypnotized by this American girl with the wary and hypnotic stare. Penelope tried to ignore her attraction. He was older and vaguely dangerous. But when he appeared at her mother's door in New York months later, asking to take her to London, any resistance collapsed. Marietta tried to slam the door in his face when she heard what he wanted. Bailey wedged his foot in and delivered an immortally cheeky line. "It could be worse. I could be a Rolling Stone." By 18, Penelope was living with Bailey in Primrose Hill, and the fairy tale of swinging London had found its final muse. She became the girl everyone talked about, the face of 1968. She shaved her eyebrows, wore vintage lace and military jackets, mixed Indian shawls with miniskirts, turning herself into a living collage of cultures. John Lennon was asked once to describe Penelope Tree in 3 words. With his usual quick-witted absurdism, he called her hot, 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 smart, smart, smart. Bailey said she was, quote, a mixture of an Egyptian, Jiminy Cricket and Bambi. Vogue covers multiplied. The pair travelled endlessly, Paris, Rome, India, Egypt, moving through the world like twin comets of the hip new culture. Their Primrose Hill home was a circus of the era's wildest characters. Rock stars and bohemians crashed on their sofa amid a squawking cloud of parrots and marijuana smoke. Bailey's friends loved her oddball charm. She was perfect for an era that was interested in character, imperfections, and eccentricity. Cecil Beaton, who visited and found the flat in chaos, wrote admiringly in his diary that she was, quote, subtle, sensitive, and highly intelligent. But inside that well, Penelope was anxious, and her deep-seated feelings of abandonment began to rise. She was, after all, still just a teenager. She adored Bailey and feared losing him. "I clung to him like a koala to a eucalyptus tree," she later said. He, meanwhile, was compulsively unfaithful, living up to the old saying, "David Bailey makes love daily." By 1970, the cracks began to show. The teenage gamine had become a woman haunted by doubt and physically brittle from starvation diets and the relentless demand to stay thin. She also suffered enormously from Bailey's endless affairs with other women. Her body rebelled. Years of malnutrition triggered hormonal chaos, and one morning she woke to find her face erupting in cystic acne. This would be a nightmare for any young person, but for one whose whole career depended on her face, it was total devastation. The fashion world sharply recoiled from her. "I went from being sought after to being shunned," she said later. "Nobody could bear to talk about the way I looked. The magazines stopped calling." The model, who had defined a decade, was finished at 21. As her career collapsed, so did her mental health. Bailey was restless, distant, forever on the move. The parties turned ugly. She began binging and purging, lost in cycles of shame and dependency. Then, in 1972, the tabloids pounced. Police raided a London squat and found a few grams of cocaine in her possession. They dragged her from her room, a dishevelled young woman the press barely recognised as the once beautiful star of Vogue. She spent the night in a cell and was denied even a phone call. "They didn't believe I was who I said I was," she recalled. By the 1970s, a counteraction had begun in earnest against the ideals of the 1960s. The newspapers turned her into another fallen angel of swinging London. Her father quietly paid for their lawyers. She escaped with a conditional discharge, but her reputation and her sense of self was gone. The following years blurred into despair. Bailey left for good, off to chase new women and new worlds. "He kinda left me. It's just that I happen to still be in the house," she said later. She was 24, alone, facially scarred, out of work and deeply depressed. She was desperate for something to take her out of this dark new world. One day, sitting on a beach in Barbados, visiting her father, she saw a sailboat drift towards shore. 3 sunburned young men climbed out, asking if she had any food. Penelope invited them home for dinner and then on a whim joined them when they set sail again. I got on the boat and I sailed with them for 6 months, she said. It was 1974, the year she vanished from public life. They sailed through the Caribbean and down the South American coast, weathering storms that terrified even seasoned sailors. For Penelope, each wave felt like an erasure of her past. No mirrors, no cameras, no gossip columns, just the motion of the sea and a group of weather-worn sailors who couldn't have cared less about any minor imperfections in her complexion. Somewhere between Barbados and Panama, she stopped being the girl on the Vogue cover and became simply a person again. That voyage, she would later say, taught her fearlessness. She had been stripped of everything, her beauty, her fame, her love, and somehow survived. When she finally came ashore, it was as though she'd been reborn. After she stepped off the sailboat, Penelope Tree was no longer famous. She was just a woman in her mid-20s, penniless, wandering about and very much alive. For a while she drifted between London and Los Angeles, then followed a current toward Australia. The chaos of swinging London had seen its reckoning in the harsh light of the 70s. Many of her old circle were addicted, fading into middle age or dead. Penelope had escaped. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew what she'd left behind. In fact, by 1978, she was able to even laugh at that version of Penelope from 10 years earlier, as evidenced when she reappeared briefly, almost as a ghost of her old self, in The Ruttles, the Beatles parody film, in which she played a cameo version of Penelope Tree. It was a joke she could afford to make by then. That same year, she married Ricky Fattar, a South African-born musician and sometime beach boy, who gave her something she'd never really had, a bit of normalcy. They moved to Sydney and rented a modest house by the ocean. There were no photographers at the wedding, no models at the table, no paparazzi hiding in the trees. The following year, she became a mother. Her daughter, Paloma, was born in 1979. Penelope later said she had never even held a baby before that moment. When the infant was placed on her chest, she felt an electric rush of love, so powerful it seemed to rewrite her DNA. But domestic calm didn't last. By the early 1980s, the marriage had begun to crumble. Penelope loved Ricky, but she felt a restlessness, the sense that another chapter was waiting. She stayed in Australia, raising Paloma and taking small jobs behind the camera, working as a researcher on documentaries. On one of those projects, she met Stuart MacFarlane, an Australian Jungian analyst. He was quiet, introspective, and curious about the unconscious, the complete opposite of every man she had ever been drawn to. They fell in love, and in him she found something closer to equilibrium than she had thought possible. They married, had a son named Michael in 1990, and built a life of intellectual calm and measured days. Through the 1980s, Penelope also began searching for meaning in other ways. The void left by fame was not filled by family alone. She tried yoga, meditation, spiritual retreats. She spent weeks in India, sitting cross-legged in ashrams, trying to silence the noise that had once defined her. In 1985, fate intervened again. A friend dying of AIDS had a ticket to hear the Dalai Lama speak in London, but was too ill to go. Penelope took the seat instead. She sat in the front row, watching the Tibetan leader, expecting nothing more than an interesting talk. When he reached out to shake her hand, something unexpected happened. I realized he was the real deal, she said later, just a human being with extraordinary consciousness. From that encounter on, Buddhism became the focus of her life. She studied its teachings, practiced daily meditation, and turned her attention outward to others. By the early 1990s, she was volunteering with Lotus Outreach, a charity working to support girls in Cambodia and India, and she continued to devote herself to helping others via various organizations. She had found peace, and it seemed she had answered at least some of the difficult questions from her childhood, at least in the sense of coming to terms with the fact that not having all the answers was something she could live with. Bizarrely, however, one of the answers would be blurted right in her face in the most unexpected way. In 1990, at a party in Sydney, an acquaintance, perhaps careless, perhaps cruel, casually told her something that stopped her cold. "You know your father was gay, don't you?" Penelope froze. Her father, Ronald Tree, the man she had adored despite his aloofness, who she had admired and loved and desperately tried to find ways to really know, was suddenly revealed to her in a way she had never expected. Ronald had died 14 years earlier. Suddenly his melancholy, his absences, his gentleness with her own struggles made sense. The revelation didn't wound her. On the contrary, it clarified him. "It explained everything," she said later. "The secret gave shape to the sadness she'd always sensed but could never name. Her parents' loveless marriage, her mother's bitterness, his retreat to Barbados, it was all part of a buried truth." She had spent her youth being photographed, defined by appearances, and here in middle age, she was seeing what lay beneath. The truth was neither scandal nor shame. It was liberation, at least for his memory. It allowed her to love him more completely, and to eventually forgive both parents for their failures, albeit with the tragic irony that her father was already gone. In fact, in a novel called Piece of My Heart, she published in 2024, she would reimagine the scene. A daughter walking in on her father with his lover, saying nothing, simply understanding. I'll put a link to it in the description. It's actually a fantastic read and a real slice of late 60s life in all its groovy decadence, well worth picking up a copy. On the book's cover is a photograph taken by her first love, David Bailey. At the book launch, she thanked him publicly. "My first love," she said. It was not sentimentality, but more closure. By that time, Bailey was an old man battling dementia. Penelope still visited him, calling him the old bugger, laughing gently at their past. They had both survived the mythology that had consumed so many of their peers. "Every single day of our lives together was extraordinary," she told one interviewer. "Nothing in the world would have stopped it." However, her relationship with her mother would take a lot more healing. Marietta died in 1991, the year after the revelation about Ronald, never having reconciled with her daughter. When asked, Penelope described her bluntly as, quote, "a crap mother," but also admitted she had inherited her mother's drive. In the decades that followed, she lived quietly between England and Australia, raising her children, studying, teaching, and occasionally returning to fashion, not out of nostalgia but curiosity. When Burberry asked her to appear in a 2008 campaign beside Kate Moss, she accepted, not as a comeback, but as a statement that beauty changes and that time could be its ally. She was 58 and still luminous without any artifice, no Botox, no surgery. "Why only use 21-year-olds?" she asked, "when most of the population are not like that?" By the time Penelope Tree turned 60, the girl who once embodied rebellion had become a symbol of calm. The photographs that had once haunted her had turned into artifacts of another era. To younger generations, they looked prophetic, like postcards from a world that believed youth could change everything. In 2012, she modeled for photographer Nick Knight. In 2023, at 74, she appeared in a Vivienne Westwood campaign, shot by Jürgen Teller, still unmistakable. Still, there were ghosts that refused to vanish entirely. When asked about her mother, she would pause before answering. "I've made peace," she said at last. She was what she was. Today, at 75, she still lives in rural Sussex, walking her dog through fields in the early light, her face weathered, alert, strikingly beautiful and unmistakably hers. The world that once devoured her image now seems a distant rumour. Yet somewhere in an archive, the photographs remain. Penelope in feathers and fringe, Penelope in black eyeliner, Penelope half lit against a camera's flash. They belong to history now, but the woman herself has slipped their grasp. She is what she has always been, a total original. Well, I hope you enjoyed this first ever episode of Society Mysteries. I quite enjoy the idea of covering more varied figures than I can over on Rock and Roll Mysteries. I'll be doing a lot of interesting people from the 20th century, but I might even dip back further to the Victorian era, or even beyond. Why not throw me a few names in the comments to let me know who you'd like me to cover? And be sure to give this one a like and a share. Let's get this new channel off the ground. I've been Chester. Thanks for watching. Cheers.